Recording in progress.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this panel on Chinese influence in Latin America. My name is Alexander Gocho. I'm with the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, and I work closely with our director, Brian Fonseca, and our esteemed guests that are here on such short notice on getting this panel together. We were fortunate enough that they were in town, and now we have a star-studded event to discuss the topic today. I wanted to give a special thanks out to Dr. Anthony Pereira, who's going to be joining us here shortly, of the Latin American and Caribbean Center, as well as Dr. Julie Zeng from the School of International and Public Affairs for co-sponsoring this event and for willing to moderate the panel. I also want to give thanks to our panelists who are joining us today and the organizations for also co-sponsoring the event. It's very nice of them. I'm going to pass it now to Dr. Pereira, who's going to start us out with some words.
Thank you. Just to elaborate on our partners, Jack Gordon, of course, the Department of Politics and International Relations, Asian Studies at FIU, and of course the LAC, the center that I direct. Also, Andrés Bello Foundation and the Dialogue Leadership in the Americas. Thanks for putting this together. And I'm very pleased to be here because I have to apologize in advance. I can't stay for the whole thing, but I'm gonna be here for part of it. And if you had to ask yourself, what is the single most important change that's occurred in Latin America and the Caribbean over the last 20, 25 years, one of the likely answers would be the rise of China as a trade partner, number one or number two trade partner for most countries in the region, as an investor, as a political actor. So hugely important topic. My own interest is partly stimulated by the fact of talking to people who witnessed the US government's attempts to get the Brazilian government to keep Huawei out of its 5G auction, which it didn't succeed in doing. And I think often there was a bit of a dialogue of the deaf where the Brazilian approach was, we're a developing country, cost matters to us. Why should we pay attention to these abstract geopolitical arguments that the US government is making to us? So I think there's a challenge there. And I think also one of the striking things about the current situation is that when you read some of the language about China-US tensions, you almost reminded of the Cold War. And you think, well, this is kind of language of two countries that are intensely separated from one another and that are in some kind of quasi-Cold War. But when you look at the investment data and the data on trade, these are two highly integrated countries economically, huge amounts of investment and trade in each other's economies. So I just wanted to mention those two things of just something that I'm personally interested in, and welcome our visitors. Welcome, Julie, for moderating this panel, and get out of the way and let this event take place. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Pereira. Now we're going to move on to the panel, which is moderated again by FIU's own Dr. Zeng. Dr. Zeng has been with the university for several years now and has published quite a number of items on the topic of China, specifically on land reform policies and state-run capitalism. She teaches undergraduate and graduate level courses on international relations in East Asia, political economy of China, and comparative studies of privatization. So if there's anyone who knows much about China, it's Dr. Zeng. So with that, Dr. Zeng, please.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Tingzhen. I'm Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at FIU. And it's my great honor to be moderating today's panel discussion on an important and timely topic, China's growing influence in the Americas. Thank you for joining us in person or virtually. So over the past 20 years, China's influence in the region has grown rapidly. 20 years ago, China's market was only less than 2% of Latin America's exports. But today, China is the top trading partners for South America and the second largest for Latin America as a whole, just behind the United States. In less than 2 decades, China has grown from little presence in Latin America to becoming one of the most important investor, foreign direct investment, and also the source of lending in infrastructure and energy. So China's growing presence is also feasible in its participation in peacekeeping operations in Haiti, as well as its military training exercises and provision of supplies to local law enforcement across the region. So China has signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with 7 Latin American countries, the highest classification Beijing awards to its diplomatic allies. The rapid expansion of China's influence in the region has been controversial. Proponents of China's engagement has portrayed China as a partner which provided host countries with jobs, infrastructure, and much needed capital. Yet critics generally depict China as a predator that has created dependency relations, favored corrupt elites, left countries with excessive debts, and also imposed downward pressures on labor and environmental standards. So China's growing influence in Latin America is also causing concerns in the United States and its allies, because they were very worried, concerned that China could use its economic power for strategic objectives. So is China a partner or a predator? So how has China's influence in the region evolved over the last 2 decades? And what are the geopolitical repercussions of growing China-Latin American relations for the United States? How should the US respond? These are some of the questions we are going to tackle today. So it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our 2 panelists today, Margaret Myers and Parsifal de Sola Alvarado. Both are top experts on China-Latin American relations. Thank you. We are very delighted to have you here with us today. Margaret Myers is the director of the Asia-Latin American program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She has published extensively on China's relations with the Latin America and the Caribbean region. In 2016, she published 2 co-edited volumes, The Political Economy of China-Latin American Relations, co-edited with Dr. Carlo Weiss, and The Changing Currents of Trans-Pacific Integration, China, the TPP, and Beyond, co-edited with Dr. Adrian Helms. Margaret has testified before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the China-Latin American relations. She's regularly featured in major domestic and international media. She's a member of the faculty at Georgetown University, the George Washington University, and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Margaret previously worked as a Latin American analyst and China analyst for the US Department of Defense, during which time she was deployed with the US Navy in support of Partnership of the Americas. She was a counsel on a foreign relations term member. She was also the recipient of a Freeman Fellowship for China Studies, a Fulbright Specialist Grant to research China-Colombia relations in Bogota, and a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellowship. In 2018, she was identified by Global Americans as one of the new generation of public intellectuals. Parsifal is the executive director of the Andrew Bello Foundation China Latin American Research Center. He's a Chinese foreign policy analyst specializing in Sino-Latin American relations with a focus on Venezuela. He's a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Between 2019 and 2020, he acted as Chinese foreign policy advisor to the Foreign Affairs Minister of the interim government of Venezuela. Parsifal lived in Beijing between 2008 and 2016, where he worked as a researcher and a communications manager for the news agency China Files. He holds a bachelor's degree in telecommunications engineering from Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, an MA in East Asian Studies from Columbia University, a second master's degree in international politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, and an advanced language diploma from Beijing Language and Culture University. So welcome to both of you. And we will first have our panel discussion and then followed by 15 minutes Q&A session with the audience. So Margaret, let me start off with you. How influential is China in Latin America and the Caribbean at this juncture? Is China's influence more evident in some countries and sectors than others?
Well, I think you've spelled it out very, very beautifully in your introductory remarks, Dr. Zeng, that China's economic engagement at this particular juncture is really very extensive, whether we're talking about the trade relationship. And as you mentioned, China is a top trade partner, the top trade partner for several countries in South America, and a second top trade partner for several other countries. In addition to that, China is an important source of investment, foreign direct investment, certainly not the top source of foreign direct investment into the region, but nevertheless, a very important one, and especially in sectors that have been of critical interest to Latin American countries as they seek to address, infrastructure deficits, for example, and other, critical development needs. In addition to that, over the past, I would say 15 years or so, China has been an important creditor for a number of countries in Latin America, for 4 countries in particular. Venezuela has been a top recipient of Chinese finance, Brazil, Argentina, and also Ecuador. These 4 countries account for about 90% of the sovereign lending that Chinese banks, China Development Bank and China Exim Bank in particular, have given to the region. And so in all of these ways, China has become, an absolutely critical economic partner, and especially for certain countries. The trade dynamic in particular has, I think, in many ways led to a considerable degree of potential influence, right, that China might exert in the region. You have a number of countries that are highly dependent on China's market for their exports, especially exports of primary commodities such as soy or minerals, metals, oil even in certain cases. And that dependence, right, is something that would presumably, right, or theoretically at least, lend China considerable authority and considerable prospect for influence over decision-making or policy-making in these respective countries. The question is whether at this particular juncture, right, is whether China is leveraging this influence significantly in a significant way or not, and whether it needs to directly leverage this influence in order to be able to affect policy and decision making in the region. There are a handful of examples of China, looking to advance certain either economic or political objectives and working with or encouraging governments to adopt certain measures. One of the most recent examples is in relation to China's what's called vaccine diplomacy in the region, which involved the either sale or donation of vaccines to a number of countries across the region amid the COVID-19 pandemic. In one particular instance, China was upset about something that happened in Brazil. The current president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, noted that I believe it was a tweet or else publicly in some other fashion, that China was using the Brazilian public as guinea pigs for the vaccine sort of trials, right? And this was very upsetting to China. And as a result of this, we saw China withhold certain supplies, right, for these vaccines from one of the institutes, the Butantan Institute in Sao Paulo State, that had been producing Chinese vaccines. And so there are these very specific examples of China exerting some leverage in the region to achieve certain objectives, or else to, to ensure a more positive overall narrative at the bilateral level. In most cases, though, China's influence is very indirect. Countries recognize that either they have a very extensive economic relationship with China and would very much like to maintain that, or they are seeking to expand relations with China to attract more in the way of foreign direct investment, to potentially attract finance in various forms, perhaps private equity engagement from the various funds that China's established across the region. And in order to do so, they feel that they need to maintain, generally positive terms with China, and so have sought, in many cases, to either engage with China in purely positive ways or to avoid topics, avoid decisions that might upset the relationship. And this includes as concerns topics of considerable sensitivity to China and involving, Chinese sovereignty, for example, on Taiwan, or Xinjiang and human rights issues, or any of these other issues that China has a very firm position on. And so we don't see many efforts among Latin American countries to take a stand on issues that might in any way disrupt bilateral relations. Whether this is the effect of China's influence and China's extensive economic engagement in the region or not is not entirely clear, but one might assume that indeed Latin American, Caribbean nations are making decisions based on what they perceive to be considerable prospect for future economic engagement and with China and the maintenance of what they perceive to be a very complementary relationship at present.
Thank you, Margaret, for giving us a very nuanced understanding of China's influence in the region. So when we talk about China, it sounds like we're talking about one unitary rational actor, but actually on the ground that there's a multitude of actors with competing, maybe most of the time with competing interests. So let's move our focus from the state to Chinese companies and projects. So Parsifal, I would like to ask, how have Chinese projects and companies evolved over the last 2 decades? Are they investing in new areas or new types of projects?
Thank you, Julie. Well, building on what Margaret just mentioned, and your comment on China being a very diverse, a very multifaceted actor. This is not just the CCP, this is not just SOEs, and even within the state, there are a lot of competing parties. We could say the same thing from the Latin American side. Latin America, or Latin America and the Caribbean, this toponym that we tend to use for analytical purposes, it's truly doesn't exist. It's usually most of these countries do not have any sort of coordination in terms of their foreign policy. There's no blocks. Organizations like Mercosur, well, we said this right now with Uruguay trying to negotiate its own free trade agreement with China. They have a lot of internal issues, and it's always been one of the Achilles heels of the region of not actually coordinating or trying to coordinate their foreign policies when it comes to big actors like the United States and like China. So narrowing down to your question about, the evolution, there's definitely been a change in terms of the projects that Chinese companies have been focusing on over the span of the last 20 years. The same goes with the talking points that come from the Chinese government. And again, all these talking points and projects do vary across the region. It's not the same thing to talk about China-Venezuela relations, which they went through a boom period throughout the 2000s because of domestic issues and also because of a commodity boom in large part driven by Chinese demand. So those large projects that made the headlines, those infrastructure projects, construction of railways, or corridors, the Nicaragua corridor, the Federal Pardo, these large-scale infrastructure projects have been largely left behind. This was more these types of projects are related more to those state-to-state relationship that we saw throughout the 2000s, with countries like Venezuela, like Brazil under Lula, with Evo Morales in Bolivia, well, and the list goes on. Nowadays, we have seen, especially in this quote unquote post-pandemic world, there is in a large sense we've seen a more localized approach from on the one side from the Chinese state, but also from Chinese companies, be them private or public. We're seeing, and Margaret has done some great work on this. We've seen a rise on greenfield projects, mergers and acquisitions, and this we could say is a broader trend that we could see across the region. I would say that that is the main change and or evolution when we talk about China Latin America relations, especially nowadays over the past couple of years. Coming out of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of focus on technology-based projects, and these are smaller Chinese companies. As I mentioned, through mergers and acquisitions, we see a lot of cooperation springing out from the different parts of local economies when it comes to smart cities, development of green industries or investment in new energy. So if we want to think about the next 5 to 10 years, odds are that we will see more of this type of engagement, shifting from the a top-bottom approach, which has characterized Chinese engagement with the region, with something more diverse, more multifaceted, and focused on these key industries that China is trying to self-promote as a great power that is going to lead the industries of the future.
Thank you. Can I follow up with what you talked about, this localization approach, and also the shift from the top down to more diverse, multifaceted approach? I think this is very interesting, but do you think that this will actually facilitate localization efforts to facilitate technology transfer and the skill transfer to the recipient states?
So let me see how to frame this. Again, it really depends on where you're standing across a region. And I think the answer to your question will depend a lot on local regulations. I always like to use an example which puts talking about the two extremes of Chinese engagement in the region over the past 15, 20 years. We have Venezuela on one side, where engagement has, broadly speaking, failed. A lot of Chinese efforts in the country, the loans have gone to waste, Venezuela's domestic situation has spiraled out of control. And in many sense, China has tried to stay away from Venezuela, and this has affected bilateral relations, and they have deteriorated profoundly over the past 5 to 8 years. And then we have on the other side, we have the Chilean case, which has been a successful example of what, in theory, relations between China and Latin American countries should look like, according to both governments. In Chile's case, because we see strong institutions, because it's basically a developed country, the results of Chinese engagement, of Chinese the projects by Chinese SOEs or private sector, for the most part, have been very successful. And these are the same companies. It's not like, some companies go to Chile and others went to Venezuela. It's the same SOEs. It's the same companies that work in the extraction industries, but with stark different results. So why is that? You have to look more at local conditions. You have to look at the state of institutions, rule of law, regulators, and that sort of let's just say oversight mechanisms that exist locally. If they're poor, Chinese companies and the state will work in a different way, despite them being the same companies. And in these cases, it tends to be a top-bottom approach. It's through the state. In countries like Chile, it's the other way around. You see Chinese companies participating in biddings. You see them going through proper channels, and obviously, well, that shows very different results.
Thank you. So let's shift gears to domestic politics. Many Latin American countries, including Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and now Colombia, are ruled by leftist governments, which tends to emphasize national sovereignty and the need to strengthen the state as an agent of social transformation. So Margaret, in your opinion, is there an ideological affinity between Chinese government and the leftist governments in Latin America? To what extent will the shifting political landscape in Latin America affect China's relations and influence in the region?
Thank you, Julie. Well, it's a great question, especially since we're sort of on the precipice now of the Brazil elections, and it's unclear, what the result will be. And I think, if Lula wins in Brazil, that could be a real boon for the China-Brazil relationship, bilateral relationship. But I'd say that, historically speaking, and by this I mean over the past couple of decades, this period of enhanced engagement, Chinese engagement with the region, we've seen a really very pragmatic approach on the part of China to engaging with Latin American countries and with Latin American and Caribbean governments, right? There has been, in some cases, a preference for engaging countries that happen to have leftist governments. For example, I mentioned that so much of China's finance from China Development Bank and China Exim Bank over the past couple of decades has gone to Venezuela, Ecuador under Correa, right, which was at that time a leftist government. There was also considerable finance to Brazil under Dilma and under Lula, and then also to Argentina under Cristina Kirchner. So all of these governments, which all were leftist governments, received considerable amounts of finance. Does that mean that China has an ideological affinity for these countries? One could come to that conclusion. My view is that these countries were attractive to China for three other reasons, right? These governments and working with these governments in these countries in particular were attractive. And those reasons are, first of all, that these governments or these countries welcomed China, right? At a moment in time, very early in China's period of enhanced engagement with the region, when China didn't have as easy a time engaging with a lot of different countries. It was new to the region. Chinese companies did not have the sorts of networks, the sorts of connections, contacts, right, that a lot of other companies had that have been well established for a matter of decades or even centuries, or over a century, that is. So so these were countries and governments that embraced China with open arms, right? Whereas others did not in certain cases. These were also, governments that operated in, generally speaking, to oversimplify things a bit, a top-down manner, right? And for China Development Bank and for the companies that were, engaging at that time, this was, very much along the lines of how they were acting in China, right? This is the sort of governance structure that they were accustomed to in general. And so it made sense at that period in time, given that they did not know these countries well, right, or the operating environments well, to engage directly with governments that were willing to engage and to trust in them to carry out certain projects and to work with Chinese actors, companies, banks to make things happen in a successful way. Whether that happened or not is a different story entirely, right? But that was the intent early on. These countries also had resources that China needed. We think about, these 4 countries that I'm talking about, and oil in particular was of interest at the time. A lot of the loans that China gave, that China Development Bank in particular gave to the region, were backed by oil. And so this was the case in Venezuela, certainly in Ecuador, and also in Brazil. Argentina does not have any commodity-backed loans, but nevertheless has been an important partner from a commodity exportation perspective. So these are all reasons why why China may have engaged with these governments at this particular period of time. Whether or not China engages more or less with a given government has very little to do with that government's ideological affiliation, but rather with the extent to which government is welcoming of Chinese engagement, right? Whether we're talking investment or other forms of cooperation. Some, governments across the political spectrum have exercised different degrees of interest, right, in engaging with China and Latin America. And there's plenty of examples of that. I'll say that even when China runs into political obstacles in countries, for example, when Macri assumed the presidency in Argentina, there was an effort to sort of revisit some of the contracts, some of the deals that were negotiated by his predecessor, Cristina Kirchner. And that led to some delays in projects and delays in payments to Chinese companies and also to Argentine companies, for that matter, partner companies. This was problematic for China, and it was a lesson for China. And as a result of that, that particular lesson, we've seen a real effort, especially in Argentina, but also across the entire region, to bypass sometimes central government inefficiencies and to go local. That is to engage with provinces at the province or state level, at the municipal level, and even with towns, right? In certain cases, you see some engagement with, smaller cities of 200,000 or even fewer people, depending upon the sorts of resources or interests or commercial factors or whatever it is that may be guiding Chinese presence there. So I would say, this is a very complex answer to your question, but I would say that China's engagement is not ideological in nature. It's very pragmatic. There are interests on the Latin American side often in engaging with China as a way to diversify partnerships and among some leftist governments to avoid over-reliance on the US or US-backed institutions. So certainly perhaps on the Latin American side, there's this preference, but on the Chinese side, it's been an interest in engaging across the board and finding ways to do that by evolving, adapting, and changing strategy whenever needed.
Thank you. This is a very important point, that the programmatic approach by the Chinese government and also Chinese companies, how they maneuver and try to gain a foothold in local markets. So Parsifal, given your expertise in Chinese foreign policy in the region, I would like to ask you a few questions about China's diplomacy. How much leeway do Chinese representatives in the region have in the public and private discourse? What are the differences between China's diplomatic corps across the region?
Sure thing. We recently did a research project on Chinese digital diplomacy over the past couple of years, and did a year-on-year comparison on talking points that the Twitter accounts of Chinese embassies, consulates, ambassadors, and consuls talked about over the past couple of years, and it pointed to some interesting results. First among those, we have that there's a lot of leeway in the talking points that ambassadors and diplomatic corps in general talk about, and we also saw that it depended on the diplomat, on the ambassador. You had on one extreme you had the ambassadors like Li Baorong in Venezuela, who were his account got blocked. One even got eliminated because of because of he was spouting out misinformation. But that account and a couple more are outliers. Obviously, across the board, we see a more proactive approach about promoting China in different sectors and accommodating the narrative for a local audience. And the talking points vary a lot. So this in a sense speaks to the amount of freedom that these diplomats and the embassies have in their own talking points. Obviously, there is a limit to that freedom of maneuver. You might say that there is some guardrails in terms of which are China's interests across the global South and in Latin America in general, and that most diplomats work within those guardrails. But again, you would find surprising that diplomatic corps in Panama, for example, is it talks on whatever topic. It even gets involved in a lot of domestic issues. Then you see more conservative ones like in Colombia, which do not get involved in domestic politics. It's more about promoting China-Colombia relations. Then you see, well, in Brazil it's very diverse. We see a very engaged diplomatic corps in domestic politics, in a sense, answering to a lot of, being reactive to a lot of domestic issues. Well, we all know Jair Bolsonaro was a very, especially throughout the pandemic, throwing out a lot of allegations and accusations about the origins of the virus and other talking points of the sorts. And we did see a pushback from local Chinese diplomats, not only through their social media accounts, but also writing op-eds in local newspapers. So, yeah, overall, you do see a lot of innovation, a lot of adaptation, and it really depends on who's in charge.
That's very interesting because we tend to think that Chinese officials have this long face and then they stick to the official lines and they will not improvise, or they will be very concerned about any repercussions to the political career. So according to your account, that actually there's a big variation that really depends on the personality. But I want to explore that. Exactly why they would do that. Is that because certain developments in the local region, that the local contacts push some higher up, that the diplomats, maybe the boss, would tell them that it's better for you to be more confrontational, be more assertive. But in other cases, maybe more conservative. Or do you think that's just of the personal choice, that those diplomats, they can do whatever they want?
I think the differences stem from generational changes. Younger diplomats, like the ambassador in Colombia, tend to be more proactive and they tend to be more positive in their messaging. And when you see diplomats maybe in their 60s, these are your more, these diplomats adhere more to your traditional, well, the traditional view we have Chinese diplomats. They're much more reactive when China is attacked in whatever form. But younger diplomats tend to be more savvy in their responses. They are not as reactive. They actually try to look for a way around the problem and avoid any sort of like direct confrontation. So I think there's a lot of that, and on top of that, younger generations, they speak fluent Spanish. They are more aware of the local context. So I would say this is part of the learning curve. 20 years ago, most diplomats didn't speak the language or did so in a very poor manner. Nowadays, we do see, positions being shifted around the region. So there's a lot of expertise being built. So the differences, I would say, adhere to those generational trends on one hand, and on the other, to basically building up expertise and knowing more about the region.
Dr. Zeng, might I add to that? I couldn't. It's a fascinating observation about the generational differences, and it really does, I think, resonate in the case of what happened in the amid the COVID-19 pandemic and China's engagement in the region, and also China's messaging at that particular juncture. We heard a lot at that particular moment, right, about what's called wolf warrior diplomacy, which is the use of a very pointed language, sometimes confrontational or aggressive language, to defend China and China's interests amid the pandemic and as concerns the spread of COVID-19. And we did see, just as Parsifal mentioned, some real variation there, and it was some of the older generation, right, that ended up certainly writing some of the more pointed texts, right? I'm thinking specifically of what happened in Brazil, but also in Ecuador. And there were, at the same time, I do wonder if it's not, broad guidance on, general guidance on what embassies can pursue with some, some leeway for ambassadors to make their own decisions, because you did see some ambassadors, even among the sort of the older generation of ambassadors, really embracing this idea and really embracing this more pointed language, and others sort of not rejecting the notion, but just choosing not to engage in that way. And so it was really quite interesting that the diversity in adoption, or the extent to which various embassies adopted this approach, which of course sort of championed by Zhao Lijie. But the generational aspect, I think, is a really fascinating one.
Yes, thank you for really helping us to understand this wolf warrior diplomacy, that the new generation of the diplomats obviously departs from Deng Xiaoping's principle of keeping a low profile, that try to maybe choose their own way that to tackle some issues to defend the Chinese interests, whether that's reactional or maybe more proactive or even confrontational. Thank you. So Parsifal, what are the differences between China's backdoor diplomacy and official public narratives in Latin America and the Caribbean?
On this topic, there's not a lot of research. Actually, it's very, very scarce. So I'll speak about a specific case study and one in which I was actually involved in, and it's regarding the China-Venezuela relationship, specifically in 2019. To put you all into context, 2019, the de jure government by Juan Guaidó was installed, and this triggered a frenzy on the Chinese side on basically how are we going to deal with this, because it's from the Chinese perspective, it was the first time that the Maduro government was thoroughly challenged. So how to deal with that? You had, in theory, two parallel governments one that is friendly to China and the other one that is, at least in perception, it was perceived as being a puppet of Washington and being anti-China. That it's in the public sphere. So if we see how how the Foreign Affairs Ministry reacted, how the Chinese embassy in Caracas reacted, they very much stuck to their non-intervention guns. You know, the usual talking points. This is a problem to be solved by Venezuelans. We are against any sort of international intervention. Tacitly, you know, talking about, well, implicitly involving the United States and saying that how they were completely against any sort of intervention, especially a military one. That being said, you know, let's talk about now that what was happening behind closed doors. They will thoroughly deny this, but I can tell you from personal experience, because I was involved in the process. There was eventually there was a communication channel, an unofficial one established between the Guaido leadership and the Standing Politburo. The thing is, you know, and this is, I think it's a very common approach from the Chinese side to be able to work through third parties in order to know what's going on, but not establish a direct communication with, in this case, the interim government. And that's actually how it worked. It was through third parties. There was no communication from top leadership to top leadership. But the fact is that they were proactive in knowing what the stances of the interim government were vis-a-vis China's participation in Venezuela. Eventually, the communication channel goes silent, and my read is that the momentum of the interim government had passed, and they didn't see that Maduro's government was in any jeopardy. So they just lowered the communication level to a foreign ministry one. In the end, through the embassy in Caracas. So, one important aspect of it. At the same time, the Chinese actually sent a delegation across Latin America to find out what local perspectives were on the Venezuelan issue. And this was done at a very low key level. They basically talked to political parties, to ex-diplomats that were friendly to China in some way or another, to basically ask them, you know, what's going on in Venezuela? What's your read on the situation? So even though there's not direct involvement, it's a very, and this goes in line with what Margaret just mentioned. There's no ideology in these negotiations. It's just, it's very interest driven. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to know if they could get any light on how the crisis would evolve, to be able to make decisions on you know, how to deal with both parties, Maduro on the one side and the interim government on the other. So even though there's differences between what's going on back doors and what's going on in front of cameras, they always tend to, it's very, how to say it, there's not, at least in terms of their interests, there's no difference in the talking points that they make in front of the cameras as the ones that make behind.
That's fascinating, this backdoor diplomacy. So when the interim government and the Chinese top leaders or the diplomats that have this bargaining or negotiation, is there any concrete results, or did the Chinese government actually provided assistance or some substantive maybe help to the interim government, or everything was just in a talk at that time?
Mostly talk. There was, even though there was at least some, we could say it was aspirational in terms of, to maybe try to participate in some sort of negotiation, but it never materialized, which leads us to think that this was just a way to maintain the engagement, and they never were truly willing to act, because usually when the conversation started talking about, well, maybe it'll support the European initiative or the talks in Norway, and all those questions were skipped or just never answered upfront.
Thank you. That's another very good example of China's programmatic approach to Latin American countries. So Margaret, the media and existing literature tend to focus on the economic aspect of China's engagement with Latin America. Is there any evidence that China exerts influence over policy making or other decision making in the region?
So there are, I mean, as I mentioned sort of earlier, there are a handful of examples of changes that have been made by Latin American governments at different levels, be it at the, at the national level or the subnational level, in favor of Chinese commercial or political interests. And this includes, the changes in legislation, for example, in the mining sector in Peru that happened a number of years ago, or changes in legislation under Christina Kirchner to allow Chinese companies to not bid on projects if they provided finance for those projects. So there was a law that was passed that allowed Chinese companies specifically to do that. And so there are examples of these things happening. The question is whether, behind closed doors or only a fly on the wall knows, right? And those who are there in the room, is whether, there was a direct effort to exert influence to pressure the government to do this, whether this was a Chinese suggestion or whether this was something that the government and, related stakeholders chose to do on their own accord. Understanding that, for example, allowing Chinese companies to not bid for projects would result potentially in more projects and more finance for those projects. I mean, this is the enduring question is, yes, China has a lot of influence. Is it being exerted directly, right? In some of these, behind closed door discussions, or is it, are these decisions that governments are taking on their own accord in order to advance the relationship in some form, whether commercially or otherwise? But what we are seeing across the board are decisions being made that in many cases do, favor China's various interests. There are also, as I mentioned before, there is evidence of Latin American countries not making certain decisions or not saying certain things in order to avoid, dampening relations or risking deterioration of relations in any form. And this includes, most recently there was a vote in the UN Human Rights Council about whether or not to discuss what's happening in Xinjiang, and you had Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina abstain from that vote, and as a result of that, and several other countries opposing that decision or opposing the decision to address this issue at all. It was not brought up within the meeting. And so, it's a difficult question. There are not a lot of, I think, concrete examples of China exerting, extensive influence at this particular juncture. Whether that changes or not sort of remains to be seen.
Thank you. So you have written a very nice article for FIU on the localization of China's outreach in Latin America and the Caribbean. How is China affecting local level decision making?
China, at this point, I tend to say that there are sort of three things happening right now in the China-Latin America dynamic, right? The first is that we're seeing a tapering of overall engagement. Economic engagement, that is, right? We're seeing finance really slowing quite considerably. That's been a trend really since 2015. We are seeing, some considerable fluctuation, which may be, pandemic related or not, in foreign direct investment. And we are also seeing a localization of activity. That is driven by wide-ranging factors. I talked before about, an effort to avoid engagement at the national level because it's sometimes problematic, especially if there's a new government that perhaps opposes some of the agreements or decisions made by previous governments, creates impediments for those projects. And so going local is a way to sort of avoid dealing with governments that may have a more contentious relationship, right, with China, at least for a period of time. Going local also makes sense because a lot of what China is doing at this particular juncture, right, is selling services and goods that are applicable at the local level, right? So if we're talking about smart cities, safe cities technologies, other technologies that that have, artificial intelligence and other functions, a lot of these are being adopted by municipalities or other localities. And so it makes sense that a lot of this engagement would take place at the local level, at least at first, and then, approved perhaps by ministries of interior or other ministries that serve these functions. And I think also, another major driver of this localization is the Belt and Road Initiative itself. We tend to think about the Belt and Road Initiative as a purely infrastructure thing, right? This is how it's often described. But really, the Belt and Road Initiative is a connectivity enhancing initiative, right? And this connectivity is defined in many different ways. It's trade facilitation, it's financial integration, it's infrastructure, certainly, it's policy coordination, but it's also people-to-people connectivity. And a lot of what China's doing, and especially over the past few years, right, including amid the pandemic, is to focus on this element of the BRI. We haven't seen huge railways being built across the entirety of the region, right? We have seen a number of projects, but a lot of those are acquisitions, right? It's not greenfield, it's not new building. What we're seeing, if we're seeing anything, right, is an extensive focus on building human infrastructure, right? This is human connectivity, people-to-people connections. And this is, something that we see among institutions, right? For example, universities. Brian Fonseca and I wrote a piece on sort of outlining the extent of educational cooperation that we see between China and Latin America, and this has exploded in recent years, right? This activity, but also, public diplomacy and so many other forms. And there are wide-ranging actors responsible for carrying this out. We see them engaging at the, central government level, at the regional level, even through, platforms such as the China CELAC Forum, but especially at the local level, with local institutions that may be in cities, that may be in provinces or states, with actors, that have some decision-making authority in these various localities. And they are doing so in pursuit frequently of commercial objectives, right? One example that I tend to point to is an engagement between Chinese actors, wide-ranging Chinese actors in the Jujuy province in Argentina. And in that particular instance, we saw over a span of just 5 years, more than a dozen actors going back and forth, right? So some of them civil society, some of them were, university actors. There was Guizhou province had several folks who came in and engaged with Huhui province actors. We saw, researchers from data centers in China, researchers on lithium extraction coming and sharing their stories. And so all of this resulted over a period of 5 years in 4 major deals. This included the largest solar facility, right? Solar energy facility in South America, a major data center project, right? Lithium extraction projects and exploration projects, and then also surveillance technology across much of the province. And so, yes, I mean, the localization is happening across the board. The extent to which it's influential or not really varies. In some cases, these projects have been this outreach has been extremely productive. Huhui is one example of that. In other cases, less so. We've seen 10 years of engagement with Coquimbo, Chile, in pursuit of a possible tunnel project there and maybe some extractive activity, but that's yet to materialize. That doesn't mean that, that China will stop engaging. However, we still see a lot of resources, human resources and financial resources being dedicated to maintaining that relationship, perhaps, and with the expectation that it will be fruitful at some point. But yes, I mean, this is a major trend right now, localization. And the third trend, I forgot to mention it, in the China-Latin America dynamic is a focusing of activity on sectors that are of critical interest to China as China looks to continue growing at moderate at moderate rates in the coming years. And that includes mostly things like new infrastructure, right? Innovation and technology related investments. And that, as I said, is often taking place at the local level.
Thank you. These localization efforts of the Chinese actors is really fascinating. So I would like to ask about a question about Chinese multinationals. Although some of those merger and acquisition stories, large ones especially, grab the media attention, but we know relatively little about how Chinese multinational corporations operate on the ground, especially in Latin America, that it has huge language, normative and cultural barriers for Chinese investors. And on top of that, we have this deterioration of China-US relations. So how, in your opinion, how did Chinese multinationals gain foothold in Latin America amid the rising tensions between China and United States?
One of the initial ways, I mean, as I mentioned previously, it was not easy for China and Chinese companies when they first came to the region, right? They were facing extensive competition, right, from existing companies, be they international companies or local companies. They were facing, investment environments that they knew very little about, had no networks, I remember going to one of the first China Latin America conferences, and there was sponsored by the Inter-American Development Bank, and there was a booth on Latin America, and it was all palm trees, and the Chilean delegation came by and they said, "What is this about? This doesn't represent Latin America as a whole." And so, I think it made sense at the time, but clearly demonstrated that there was not an expansive understanding of what all Latin America represented at that particular juncture. So how did Chinese companies, multinationals, just state-owned enterprises, private companies, establish a presence in the region? They did so, first of all, through a lot of this sovereign lending, right? Through loans from China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank, which were frequently tied to the use of Chinese companies, right? And also the exportation of Chinese equipment. So achieved a couple of very important objectives for China, which was to internationalize Chinese companies and to find new export markets and expand overall global exports. And indeed, doing so helped Chinese companies to establish something of a presence. They executed these projects, they began to develop a reputation, they began to develop these networks of contacts that they would need. And now, they don't really need this mechanism, this approach anymore to be able to strike deals. They're doing that on their own. They're doing public-private partnerships. They're partnering with local companies in certain instances. They're doing major mergers and acquisitions. They still receive finance from Chinese banks frequently, but not this sort of sovereign lending tied loans model that we've seen in the past. And so how do Chinese companies now, as they're competing, with the US or in this sort of, increasingly contentious US-China dynamic compete? They compete in the same way they've been competing all along, regardless of the U.S.-China, dynamics at play, and that is by offering competitive prices. Frequently, Chinese companies are subsidized and so are able to offer things at lower cost, right? They have sometimes received preferential financing at very low interest rates, 1% in certain cases from Chinese banks, and so are able to take higher levels of risk frequently than other companies have done. They also, Chinese companies in general are interested and have been all along in sectors that many other companies are not interested in, either because the risk is perceived to be too high, or because there just isn't an interest in investing or financing counter-cyclically when the region is having a difficult economic moment. And China has expressed some interest in doing that all along. So we see a lot of interest in infrastructure, for example, and in the acquisition of projects, large-scale infrastructure at moments in time when a lot of other companies are leaving the region, be it post-global financial crisis or now. And so it remains to be seen whether we see big new acquisitions of projects or not, whether China comes to the rescue, so to speak, right, in the Latin American context as in this period of recovery from COVID-19. But that will be very illustrative. It will give us a sense of how much interest Chinese multinationals, Chinese state-owned enterprises have in continued relations with Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you. Given a time constraint, let me jump to the last question on my list. Two questions. How should the U.S. respond to China's growing interest in Latin America and the Caribbean? Is there any room for cooperation between the two great powers in the region?
Very broad question. My short answer would be compete. Most of the rhetoric that we've been seeing coming out of Washington, especially during the Trump administration, has been very anti-China. Talking points have focused on do not cooperate with China. China is a threat. This kind of rhetoric falls on deaf ears, and it ends up having the opposite effect of what the U.S. government, the U.S. companies actually want, which is to minimize China's influence in the region, or even block the access of Chinese companies to the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So short answer, they're build on U.S. strengths and not make the conversation a China conversation. If you make it a China conversation, you'll get the door will be shut right on your face. Make it a local conversation, buttressed on U.S. strengths. What do I mean by U.S. strengths? This was actually the words of a colleague, Pepe Jiang, earlier this morning, where he described the China-Latin America relationship as very one-dimensional. It's very economic based. It's very pragmatic, and it's seen the same way from the Latin American perspective. So, on the other hand, the U.S. relationship with the region goes back decades. It involves NGOs. It involves family links. It involves cultural engagement. So working through the already established links will have a let's just say more potential in actually influencing and making more space for, be it U.S. companies or Western companies in general.
Thank you. Margaret,
I
please.
can respond to the. I would agree with Parsifal on that answer, and I can respond to the second question about whether there are prospects for cooperation. I think certainly there are prospects, right, for cooperation. Absolutely. Perhaps, I mean, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, or at least what used to be considered low-hanging fruit. Things like disaster response, on certain security issues, some cooperation addressing those. And on climate change, related cooperation. We think about the way that the U.S. and China approach climate change in the Caribbean, for example, and I'm borrowing an example from Rashid Griffith, who's a senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. You see China engaging mostly in the development, or rather in the construction of infrastructure, right, immediately after a disaster. So, when a major storm comes through the Caribbean, it wipes out infrastructure, be it telecommunications infrastructure or other infrastructure. We've seen this happen, time and again, very recently, tragically. And so, the response, the rebuilding of this infrastructure is really quite critical. The U.S. engagement in the Caribbean is very different as concerns climate, cooperation. There's a lot of research. There's a lot of working with institutions to develop policies, to develop practices that will help to help countries to adapt over time to what is a very dire situation. And so there is some degree of complementarity, right, between in these approaches, and thinking through that and how the two might even better complement each other or work together to address the needs of these island nations would be, I think, a really critical thing to do. Whether there is political appetite for this, right, is another question. And I think at this juncture, it's very clear that there is not very much political appetite for that. We will see if that changes at any point.
Thank you so much. Sorry for taking more time than I should. And now, any questions from the audience?
There's just one in the chat right now.
Okay.
So it's a little broad, but do you think that we are close to the United States exercising a more decisive veto power over China's projects in Latin America and the Caribbean, not only related to red lines and security issues?
I think we've already seen some, evidence of U.S. objection to. I don't know if we're talking about China's red lines or U.S. red lines, but in any case, so objecting to certain types of projects, right, in the region, and working closely with governments in Latin America to, encourage them to take other approaches or adopt other partners. And this has, the primary examples are, related to a cable, a trans-Pacific cable that was, going to run under the ocean from Chile to Asia. It was originally, the Chileans had originally approached Huawei for that particular project. And after much negotiation with the US and with China and with Japan, chose a different company. I believe it was NEC, Japanese company, to do that. And then another was, and there are competing versions of this story, so I'm not entirely sure what the real story is. But in any case, there was a project in Chile wherein China was going to manage personal records for the country through a system that it would employ, and there was considerable concern about privacy related to Chinese management of those records. I don't know that the U.S. intervened in any real way aside from to have these conversations, but eventually another provider was chosen for that as well. So there are these examples of this happening already. My sense is that the U.S. is at this particular juncture looking to exercise restraint, right, and to simply, or that is to say, not to interfere too much in the decision-making, sovereign decision-making as concerns, wide-ranging projects. But certainly there are sectors, there are technologies that we all know have been of considerable concern to the U.S., whether related to privacy or other matters that the U.S. has articulated.
If I may build on that, talking about the Chilean case, this was actually a Chinese company that was they participated in a public bidding and they won, and they were going to manufacture the new national IDs. And there was the U.S. intervened, and on security concerns, pushed the Chilean government with, Chileans Chile is the only country that doesn't need a visa to come to the United States and throughout Latin America. And well, they basically pushed the Chilean government. Look, if this Chinese company goes and manufacture your IDs, well, basically we're going to strip away the visa waiver. Well, eventually that bidding process fell apart, and I don't remember which company won it. It was, I think, a European one. My answer to the question is hopefully not. No red lines will be drawn, and these kinds of pressure points exerted by the United States might work in some occasions, like the one I just mentioned. But over the long run, in my view, they will backfire. And not only will they not work, they will end up pushing Latin American countries to the Chinese side. So, and to give an example of cases that it hasn't worked, mostly with Huawei. There's been a lot of push not to use Huawei equipment. Huawei is one of the largest players in the region, and most of that criticism on data privacy, on security issues, just ended up falling on deaf ears and creating a sort of not creating like building on top of that of anti-Americanism that a lot of sectors in the region are famous for.
Thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead.
Toward China instead of the United States, and why? Sure. I said, do you believe that people in the region are having a more positive attitude toward China instead of the United States, and why?
It's a really important question, and I think it's one that's very difficult to measure. There are a handful of polls, right, that have been done, for example, by Pew or by America Barometro, right, that try to determine the extent to which views of China and the U.S. are evolving over time. Trust in China and the U.S. is shifting. What we've seen in global sort of polls, right? If we put faith in those, right, is that the Latin American and Caribbean region tends to view China more positively than plenty of other regions. But that there is considerable variation within the Latin American and Caribbean region, and even within countries, and even within municipalities for that matter. It all depends on what sector folks work in, whether they've been affected by China in negative ways, whether they stand to gain something from China. So I mean, there's considerable variation across the board in views of China in the Latin American region. What we see in general, if the polls are accurate, right, is that South America has tended to view China more positively. than Mexico, for example, and that there's very little data whatsoever on Central America and the Caribbean in this particular respect. But what's, I think, not entirely clear is, whether any of these positive or negative views have an effect on the extent to which these countries will engage China in the future. Because as we've established right over the course of this discussion, China or Latin America is engaging China, and China is engaging Latin America on pragmatic terms based on this sense that there is some economic advantage to doing so. So whether Latin Americans trust China, whether they trust Xi Jinping and the State Council and the Chinese Communist Party or whatever, right? Or whether they love China or not, they see value in continuing to make this partnership happen. And so, maybe it doesn't matter all that much, in the end.
Thank you for the presentation. And I have a little question about the BRI in the Latin America. In this case, several countries already joined. Do you think, since around the world, other countries see it like as China taking advantage of these countries, do you think others in Latin America will join in the future still, or is it like, no?
So as Margaret mentioned in her remarks, the BRI is, nowadays, no one knows what really a BRI project is. You will find, sure, infrastructure projects, but you also find fashion shows or cuisine exhibitions. So it's really, as Margaret mentioned, a platform to interconnect Chinese projects, Chinese entities. It's sort of like a networking platform at a very, very large global scale. Talking specifically about Latin America, there are some studies that show that pre-post signing and the BRI MOU, nothing really changes. There's really no tangible economic or political benefit from joining the BRI. Will more countries join? My guess is probably yes, but this is more of a perception view that is used by China to show its growing influence across the globe and in Latin America in particular.
Thank you. Margaret, do you want to add?
I would just say, another critical question, right, for us to all bear in mind is where the BRI is heading, right, itself, right, how it's kind of intangible, right, as Parsifal mentioned, but it's also ever evolving. It's there to address China's needs, whatever they may be, political, economic, and so China's facing its own challenges right now, economic challenges, and whether that means more in the way of BRI engagement to help address and, or to help, move along certain critical or support certain critical reforms that need to take place domestically, or it means, holding back because the resources simply aren't there to engage more extensively, is unknown, something we're going to have to keep an eye on. But, as Parsifal mentioned, I think I completely agree that there'll probably be more countries that sign on, because these agreements themselves, these memorandums of understanding, are non-binding. They're largely symbolic, right? They're just a gesture, really in favor of Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy initiative, and very little more aside from that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. I think time is, we already passed the time. So thank you, Margaret and Parsifal, for the fantastic and intellectually stimulating conversation. You definitely help us to better understand different aspects of China-Latin American relations, and also the ramifications of this increased engagement. So thank you. I hope we will have another chance to learn from your expertise and continue our conversation in the near future. And thank you for joining us today.
you.